Think about the most desperate moments in history. How does a dying nation afford to survive? The American Union was bleeding out. In 1862, soldiers starved in the freezing, bloody mud. The national treasury was completely empty and facing collapse. Printing more paper money was rapidly triggering devastating hyperinflation. Abraham Lincoln desperately needed hard cash instead of heavily taxing essential civilian bread. He taxed their nightly poker games. Every single deck of cards suddenly required federal stamps. Freezing frontline troops accidentally paid for their own ammunition. The pennies quickly piled up into millions of dollars. When a desperate government targets universal human vice, it accidentally births a ruthless, uncontrollable shadow economy. Let us unearth the bizarre ledgers of the Civil War. The scale of the financial crisis was beyond comprehension. The Civil War was brutally expensive. The Union Army devoured over $2 million daily. This staggering financial hemorrhage threatened absolute, total systemic collapse. Government accountants stared blankly at completely drained, terrifying ledgers. Traditional taxation methods were proving to be dangerously insufficient. Taxing essential civilian commodities like bread invited immediate, catastrophic political rioting and starvation. To prevent a domestic uprising, a desperate state must carefully engineer taxation around expendable human desires. So they looked for money where no one else was looking. They found cash in bizarre places. The pockets of bored soldiers and desperate gamblers beckoned. The administration drafted the Complex Revenue Act of 1862, and this legislation represented an absolute masterclass in dark economics. It aggressively targeted specific, highly popular, and entirely non-essential items. By focusing on entertainment, the government successfully extracted wealth without triggering widespread civilian hunger. Taxing psychological escapism guarantees a steady, reliable revenue stream during periods of immense national trauma. Every single deck required federal stamps. You could not legally play without paying the state. The tax ranged from 1 to 5 whole cents. This completely depended on the quality of the cards. The bureaucratic machinery required to enforce this was massive. Treasury agents aggressively policed manufacturers, ensuring every single paper deck bore the official seal. When a government monetizes a universal pastime, it effectively transforms millions of citizens into unwitting financiers. But who was actually paying this tax? The front lines were plagued by boredom. Soldiers spent endless, agonizing months waiting between brutal battles. Playing cards offered the only psychological escape from terror. Decks were passed around campfires until they literally disintegrated. The demand for fresh cards among the troops skyrocketed. The very men bleeding for the Union were simultaneously funding the weapons that killed them. The profound irony of war economics is that the soldiers' own psychological coping mechanisms financed the conflict. The revenue generated was absolutely staggering. The seemingly tiny penny taxes accumulated into massive fortunes. Millions of decks were sold across the divided continent, when the federal treasury slowly began to refill its coffers. This bizarre vice tax actively stabilized the collapsing economy. The government successfully purchased precious ammunition and winter uniforms using the loose change of gamblers. A fraction of a cent, collected millions of times, possesses the macroeconomic power to sustain an empire. It seemed like a perfect system, until it wasn't. Card manufacturers initially rejoiced at the demand. Companies like Andrew Doherty saw profits absolutely explode overnight. The Union Army provided a massive, captive, and bored audience. Production lines ran continuously to supply the desperate troops. But the new federal tax stamps complicated their entire operation. Manufacturers were forced to physically alter their packaging just to accommodate the strict government mandates. Bial. When a sovereign state regulates a private industry, the resulting bureaucracy invariably alters the physical product. The stamps became complex miniature artworks. The government commissioned intricate designs to prevent widespread counterfeiting. These small adhesive squares featured the stern faces of politicians. George Washington stared out from the top of the deck. This was a constant physical reminder of the state's authority. Even in the midst of a poker game, the federal government asserted its absolute financial dominance. Branding a recreational item with state iconography subtly reinforces civilian submission to the wartime economic apparatus. But the economic burden was heavily regressive. The tax disproportionately impacted the poorest, most desperate citizens. Many wealthy officers could easily afford the 5-cent luxury tax. But for an enlisted private, a penny was significant. They were already paid incredibly poorly and often late. The state was effectively bleeding the most vulnerable members of society through their only available entertainment. Regressive taxation on psychological vices always extracts the highest human cost from the absolute lowest economic classes. To make this work, the state had to become ruthless.
Get on the ground now!
The system required absolute, rigid compliance. Treasury agents conducted surprise inspections of massive printing factories. Manufacturers who failed to affix stamps faced devastating fines. The government could literally seize their entire physical operation. This created an atmosphere of intense paranoia and strict enforcement, and the state effectively weaponized the manufacturers against themselves, forcing them to become unpaid federal tax collectors.
Federal tax is paid.
Outsourcing tax enforcement to private industry represents the ultimate efficiency of a desperate, expanding wartime bureaucracy. The sheer absurdity of the situation. Imagine fighting a bloody, continent-spanning war over human freedom and funding it through the ace of spades and clubs. The ledgers of the Union Army read like a casino. It highlights the deeply cynical, pragmatic reality of war economics. Ideology may start a conflict, but cold, hard cash is the only thing that sustains it. When the ideological foundations of a war crumble, the conflict survives entirely on ruthless, pragmatic financial extraction. And yet, the psychology of war demanded it. The demand for cards never actually waned. Despite the tax, soldiers continued to buy and play. The psychological need for distraction completely overwhelmed the financial cost. They played by the light of dying, smoky campfires. They played while waiting for the terrifying order to charge. The playing card remained the single most important psychological survival tool for the terrified Union infantryman. A desperate human mind will invariably prioritize immediate psychological relief over long-term financial security. The federal treasury breathed a sigh of relief. The massive influx of vice tax revenue provided stability. The threat of absolute hyperinflation was temporarily pushed back. The Union Army could continue to purchase essential supplies, but this success created a massive, unintended, and terrifying consequence. The government had unintentionally placed a massive bounty on the head of every single card manufacturer. Implementing a strict, highly profitable tax inevitably creates a powerful financial incentive for organized, systemic evasion. But here is the insane part. Most historical ledgers leave out this terrifying, ruthless detail. This tax didn't just save the bleeding Union Army. It accidentally created a massive, uncontrollable shadow economic market. The federal government wasn't just fighting the deadly Confederates on the bloody battlefields. They were suddenly locked in a desperate financial war against ruthless, organized counterfeiters and civilian smugglers. The moment you tax a vice, you create a cartel. The black market rapidly exploded overnight. A 5-cent tax on a 10-cent deck was outrageous. It represented an agonizing 50% artificial price increase. Opportunistic printers immediately recognized the massive, illegal profit margins. Underground presses began churning out millions of fake tax stamps in dark basements. When a state artificially inflates the cost of a cheap vice, it automatically subsidizes organized criminality. The federal treasury was heavily bleeding. Authentic manufacturers faced brutal, unfair competition from untaxed smugglers. Honest companies begged the government for strict physical protection. Treasury agents were aggressively deployed to hunt rogue printers. Armed federal inspectors violently smashed down printing shop doors seeking unauthorized, untaxed cardboard. Enforcing a vice tax fundamentally forces a desperate government to aggressively police its own domestic citizenry. Smugglers developed incredibly brilliant, deceptive tactics. They carefully washed and reused old, canceled federal stamps. They shipped untaxed cards in crates labeled as Bibles. The Union supply lines were flooded with illegal gambling. The bleeding soldiers fighting for the nation eagerly purchased this illicit, untaxed contraband. A massive shadow economy successfully proves that human demand will always aggressively circumvent artificial state barriers. The government was losing control of its own lifeline. The government faced a logistical disaster. Chasing counterfeit stamps cost nearly as much as printing. The legal loopholes were aggressively exploited by wealthy merchants. A deck of cards became a heavily contested battleground. This bizarre financial rebellion actively undermined the moral authority of the struggling treasury. The playing card crisis reveals that complex financial mandates frequently collapse under simple, relentless human ingenuity. The manufacturers demanded a radical compromise. The government allowed them to print their own stamps. Private cancellation marks theoretically prevented the massive, illegal reuse. This desperate pivot transferred the security burden onto businesses. Corporations were aggressively forced to become the primary financial shield for the state. Delegating tax enforcement to private industry signals the absolute desperation of a financially exhausted sovereign government. The chaotic black market eventually stabilized. The immense volume of legal sales finally overwhelmed smugglers. The Union successfully gathered millions of desperately needed dollars. The bloody war was literally bankrolled by a game. The profound tragedy is that their escapism directly funded their own battlefield slaughter. When survival depends on constant extraction, an empire will proudly weaponize the leisure of its citizens. But the true danger of this tax wasn't its creation, it was its permanence. The playing card tax survived. It outlasted the horrific, bloody American Civil War entirely. The government discovered the profound, addictive power of revenue. Taxing universal vice became a permanent, foundational financial strategy. The federal government continued to aggressively siphon wealth from mundane, civilian recreation.
Beat that if you can.
Once a desperate state successfully executes a behavioral tax, it rarely relinquishes that profitable control. The true cost of a hand dealt. This historical mandate demonstrates the reality of war economics. It wasn't funded purely by high-minded ideals or bonds. It was paid for by the exhausted, terrified infantryman. The psychological need for escape actively subsidized the slaughter. Every game of poker quietly purchased the lead that tore through human flesh. When a government demands sacrifice for the greater good, they frequently extract it from human weakness. Look around today. The mechanics haven't changed. The legacy of the 1862 Revenue Act. We must connect this dark manipulation to the present. Modern authorities continuously utilize these exact same psychological levers.
This is a great
They aggressively
day
tax
for public
tobacco,
health initiatives.
alcohol, and modern gambling vices. These are often framed as moral or public health choices. In reality, they are deeply entrenched, highly reliable pillars of national and state survival. The sovereign state desperately relies on the predictable, unyielding failure of human willpower. The bizarre ledgers remain open. A nation fought for freedom, financed by the spades. Complex financial logistics disguise deeply cynical methods of control. The playing card crisis reveals the terrifying depths of state extraction. Join us in uncovering the bizarre financial machinery that quietly directs global conflicts. Please subscribe, drop a like, and comment your thoughts on this massive historical deception below.